Say their names: Caiaphas, Annas. Let them sit in the air for a moment, because those names carry something that does not fade with time. Those two names represent a kind of power that most people alive today will never come close to touching: the power to decide who lives, who dies, who eats, who weeps, who God is allowed to be in a city that claimed to belong to him. These were not small men. Do not make the mistake of seeing them that way. These were architects. They built an empire inside a temple. They dressed it in religion and called it holy. They wrapped ambition in the garments of God and stood before the people as though heaven itself had authorized every move they made. And then the Son of God walked through their door. He did not come quietly. He overturned their tables. He named their corruption out loud. He called the house of prayer a den of thieves straight to their faces, in their city, in front of their people. And something in them broke. Not in repentance, in rage. So they did what powerful men always do when the truth becomes a threat. They buried it. They arranged the trial in the dark. They coached the witnesses. They pressured the governor. They stood beneath the cross on Golgotha and watched with the cold satisfaction of men who believed they had finally, permanently won. But here is what they did not know, what they could not have prepared for, what no amount of political power or temple gold or Roman alliance could have ever told them. Something followed them home from that hill. Not a ghost, not a rumor. Something heavier than both. Something Scripture had already named before either of them were born. The prophet Isaiah had written it. The Psalms had sung it. The law of divine retribution, Galatians 6-7. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap, was already in motion the moment the nails were driven in. They thought they were done with Jesus. Jesus was not done with them. What followed Caiaphas and Annas through the remainder of their lives was not the comfortable legacy of victorious men. It was the slow, relentless, humiliating unraveling of everything they had built. Their power stripped, their dynasty dismantled, their names preserved, but preserved as warnings, not honors. You need to hear what happened to them. Not for entertainment, not for shock, but because their story is a mirror, and the face looking back in that mirror may be closer to your own than you're comfortable admitting. Stay with me. What comes next will not let you go. Let me show you how power actually works. Not the power you see, not the man in the robe standing at the front of the room receiving the bows and the deference and the titles. That man is a display, a costume, a carefully constructed illusion designed to make you look in one direction, while the real hand moves somewhere else entirely. The real power in Jerusalem had a name: Annas. No robe impressive enough for what he actually was, no title broad enough to contain what he actually controlled. While high priests came and went, appointed, removed, replaced like pieces on a board, Annas never moved. He didn't need to. He had already made himself something far more durable than a title. He had made himself necessary. This is the oldest trick in the architecture of power, and it has never stopped working. You don't need the throne if you own the man sitting on it. Rome stripped Annas of his official position around 15 AD, and if you didn't know the rest of the story, you might think that was the end of him. Rome had spoken. The title was gone. Move on. But Annas didn't move on. Annas simply changed rooms. One by one, his sons rose to the high priesthood. 5 of them. 5. Not by accident, not by coincidence, not by the sovereign movement of the Holy Spirit, by strategy, by pressure, by the quiet, relentless placement of family into every position that mattered, until the sacred office of God's house had become a hereditary business, passed through one bloodline like a deed to property. And then came his crowning move. His son-in-law, Caiaphas, took the seat. And Caiaphas would hold it longer than any high priest in living memory, a full 18 years. 18 years of visible authority. While Annas sat just behind the curtain, the unseen hand that signed every invisible document, pulled every invisible string, whispered into every ear that mattered. Think about what that means. Every worshipper who entered Jerusalem, the widow carrying her 2 small coins, the farmer who had walked 3 days to make his offering, the young couple seeking God's blessing, every single one of them unknowingly walked into a system that had been engineered not for their redemption, but for the enrichment of one family. This was not religion. This was extraction, wearing the clothes of religion. Proverbs 16:18 says it plainly. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. But men like Annas never believed that verse is addressed to them. They read it as a warning for lesser people, people without their level of sophistication, people without their kind of connections. And that is precisely the blindness that makes the fall, when it comes, so total. Because here is the thing about building your empire inside a holy place. Here is the thing about using the name of God as the ceiling over your corruption. The same God whose house you have occupied, whose pilgrims you have taxed, whose sacred office you have handed to your sons, like a family inheritance that God is watching. He has been watching from the beginning. And he is not impressed by the architecture of your influence. He brought down Pharaoh. He brought down Nebuchadnezzar, drove him into the fields to eat grass like an animal, until the man acknowledged who actually ruled. He scattered the towers men built toward heaven. He has never once, in the entire history of this world, looked at a human power structure and said, I cannot reach that. And so when the Son of God walked into the very temple that Annas had turned into his personal treasury, when he overturned those tables, when he looked into the eyes of the money changers and said, My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves, that was not a religious dispute. That was a confrontation written before the foundation of the world. Annas and Caiaphas looked at Jesus and saw a problem to be managed, a voice to be silenced, a movement to be crushed before it cost them anything more. What they could not see, what their power had blinded them to completely, was that they were not the ones deciding what happened next. They never were. The strings they thought they were pulling, someone else had been holding those all along. And the moment they used those strings to condemn the Son of God, the moment they pulled that final thread, they set something in motion that would consume everything they had spent their entire lives building. Everything. Stay with me. Because what came next for these 2 men is not simply a history lesson. It is a warning. And it has your name on it. Understand what the temple had become. Not what it was supposed to be. Not what God designed it to be when he gave Moses the blueprint on the mountain. When the fire fell and the glory cloud filled the sanctuary so thick that even the priests could not stand to minister. Not that temple. What it had become. By the time Annas and his family were finished with it, the house of God was a machine, a revenue engine dressed in sacred linen, operating behind the cover of covenant, extracting wealth from the very people it was built to serve. Every element of the system had been engineered not for worship, but for control. Here is how it worked. You traveled to Jerusalem. Maybe you walked for days. Maybe you saved for months. You came hungry for God, carrying your offering, ready to present yourself before the Lord as the law commanded. And the moment you crossed into that sacred space, the system was already waiting for you. Your money was no good here. Only temple currency could purchase what you needed to worship. And who controlled the exchange? The family of Annas. They set the rates. They moved the numbers however the morning required. And every transaction, every single one, sent a cut back to the same household that had turned the house of prayer into a marketplace. Need an animal for sacrifice? They had those too. Inspected and certified. Conveniently available, at prices that bore no relationship to what the same animal cost outside those walls. The poor widow who came to give everything she had found, that everything she had was barely enough to purchase the right to enter the presence of God, the God who made her, loved her, and never once asked to be bought. Malachi 3-5. I will be swift to testify against those who defraud laborers of their wages, who oppress the widows and the fatherless. God had already named this. He had already marked it. He had already written into the prophetic record that the exploitation of the vulnerable inside the name of religion would not be ignored. But Annas was not reading Malachi. Annas was counting gold. And Rome was satisfied. Rome did not care what happened inside the temple as long as 3 things remained intact: peace, taxes, and control. Annas delivered all three with the quiet efficiency of a man who had made himself indispensable to every power structure in the city simultaneously. He was untouchable from above and unquestioned from below. It was a perfect system. Until the morning, it wasn't. A carpenter from Galilee walked through the gate. And I need you to understand, this was not a gentle entry. This was not a quiet man with a quiet message who politely requested a meeting with management. When Jesus saw what had been done to his Father's house, something ignited in him that the religious establishment of Jerusalem had never seen and was completely unprepared to face. Tables went over. Not one, all of them. Coins hit the stone floor and rang out like an alarm across the entire court. Animals broke loose. The careful, profitable machinery of Annas's empire ground to a halt in a single moment of holy fury. And into the stunned silence, the voice of the Son of God cut like a blade. My house shall be called a house of prayer. Matthew 21:13. Not a suggestion, not a theological observation. Now feel the full weight of what happened next in the halls of power. The report reached Annas, every word, and what rose in him was not conviction, was not the fear of God that Proverbs 9:10 calls the beginning of wisdom. What rose in him was something far darker, far more ancient, the rage of a man who has confused his kingdom with God's kingdom for so long that he can no longer tell the difference between the two. How dare he? How dare this man, this nobody from Galilee, this carpenter's son with no credentials, no connections, no seat at any table that mattered, how dare he walk into what we built and call it robbery? But here is the truth that Annas could not afford to face. It was robbery. It had always been robbery. And the one standing in the wreckage of the overturned tables was not a troublemaker. He was the owner of the house, and Annas had just made the last enemy he would ever make. He didn't know it yet. But the moment he began plotting to silence Jesus, the moment he decided that a secret trial, manufactured witnesses, and a borrowed execution would solve his problem, he stopped being the man pulling the strings and became the man caught in them. I want you to sit with something for a moment, not a concept, not a theological argument, a scene. The Son of God, the Word through whom all things were made, the one in whom, as Colossians 1:17 declares, all things hold together, is standing inside the walls of Jerusalem. He is not hidden. He is not theoretical. He is present, in a body, breathing the same air as Annas and Caiaphas, walking the same stones their sandals walked every single day. And they looked at him and chose the gold. Let that land. Really let it land. Because this was not a case of ignorance. These were not simple men who lacked information. These were the most educated religious minds in the most religiously saturated city on earth. They knew the scrolls. They had read Isaiah 53, the suffering servant, despised and rejected, led like a lamb to the slaughter. They had memorized Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" words that would fall from the cross within the same generation. They knew Micah had named Bethlehem. They knew Daniel had calculated the timing. They knew. And still, they chose the treasury over the truth. This is the most chilling kind of spiritual blindness, not the blindness of a man who has never seen the light, but the blindness of a man who has seen it, recognized it, and deliberately turned away because the light was going to cost him something he was not willing to pay. Jesus said it himself in John 3:19, and this is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but people loved darkness instead of light, because their deeds were evil. Annas and Caiaphas did not stumble into opposition against God. They walked into it, deliberately, strategically, with full awareness of what they were doing and a calculated commitment to the outcome they preferred. Their wealth over his worth, their position over his lordship, their system over his salvation. And now I need to speak to you directly, not to Annas, not to Caiaphas, not to figures sealed behind 2,000 years of history, to you. Watching this right now, because this temptation did not die with them. It is alive right now in every person who has enough spiritual knowledge to recognize God's voice, but enough earthly comfort to make ignoring it feel reasonable. It is alive in every boardroom, every bedroom, every private moment where a soul stands at the crossroads of what God is asking and what the world is offering, and quietly, without drama, without any public declaration of rejection, simply chooses the world. You do not have to sentence Jesus to death to make the same choice Caiaphas made. You only have to let the convenience of your current life outweigh the call that is pressing against your chest right now. That is the same sin, dressed in quieter clothes. If you have ever felt God's hand protecting you when the forces aligned against you should have won, if you have ever stood in the middle of opposition and felt something hold that had no business holding, leave a comment below right now with the words, "God defends the innocent," because somebody watching this is in the middle of that battle today. And your testimony is not just a memory. It is a weapon. It is evidence. It is the kind of proof that keeps another soul from making the choice that Annas and Caiaphas made. But now, we must walk forward into the dark, because here is the truth about men who choose power over the presence of God. They do not simply lose spiritually. They lose everything. And the losing does not always come the way they expect. It does not always arrive in the form of a dramatic, public, unmistakable moment of divine wrath. Sometimes, and this is the part that should make you stop breathing for just a second, sometimes it comes in the form of getting exactly what you asked for. They wanted Jesus dealt with. They got their trial. They got their verdict. They got their crucifixion. Every move went according to plan. Every piece fell into place. And standing at the foot of that cross on a Friday afternoon, with the body of the Galilean cooling in the stone-cold silence of a borrowed tomb, Annas and Caiaphas must have felt something close to relief. Done. Finished. Over. But Proverbs 14:12 carries a warning that neither of them was humble enough to have applied to themselves. There is a way that appears to be right, but in the end, it leads to death. Their victory was already their undoing. The tomb they sealed was already the beginning of their end. The silence they purchased with 30 pieces of silver was already cracking, because you cannot purchase the silence of God. You cannot bribe the resurrection. You cannot negotiate with an empty grave. And what was about to unfold in the hours and days and years that followed that sealed tomb would dismantle every pillar of the empire they had spent their entire lives constructing. Not gradually, not mercifully, completely. God's justice does not operate on a timeline that human ambition can outrun. It does not lose interest. It does not get distracted. It does not forget what was done on the night of that illegal trial in the flickering lamplight of the high priest's chamber. It simply waits. And then it arrives with a precision that makes it unmistakably clear that no one, not the most powerful priest in Jerusalem, not the most cunning political dynasty the Holy City has ever produced, not anyone who has ever drawn breath on this earth, no one outweighs God. The night of that trial was not the beginning of their victory. It was the beginning of their end. And what came next, what God allowed, what God ordained, what God permitted to fall upon these two men who stood in his house and chose themselves over his son. You are not ready for it, but you need to hear it. Step into the room, not as a scholar, not as a spectator, as a witness, because what happened inside the high priest's chamber on that night was not simply a miscarriage of justice. It was a confrontation between two kingdoms, one built by the hands of ambitious men, one established before the foundation of the world, and only one of them was going to walk out of that room intact. The hour was wrong. The timing was illegal. Jewish law, the very law that Annas and Caiaphas built their entire authority upon, the law they cited, enforced, and weaponized against ordinary people every single day, that law was unambiguous. Trials could not be conducted at night. Trials could not be held during festival season. The accused had the right to defense. Witnesses had to be examined separately, and a death sentence could not be issued and carried out on the same day. They broke every single one of those laws before the night was finished. Understand what this means. These were not men who forgot the rules in a moment of passion. These were legal architects. They had spent their careers constructing and maintaining the judicial machinery of Jerusalem. They knew exactly what they were violating, and they violated it anyway because the law had never been their real authority. Their real authority was their will, and their will on this night was singular, consuming, and absolute. Get rid of him. The chamber is dim. Oil lamps throw long shadows across the faces of men who have convinced themselves that what they are doing is necessary. Jesus stands in the center, bound, surrounded, outnumbered, and the witnesses begin to file in. And here is where something extraordinary happens. Something that should have stopped the entire proceeding in its tracks. The witnesses cannot agree. One steps forward. He said he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Another contradicts him before he finishes the sentence. Their stories fracture against each other in the lamplight, and every contradiction is another nail in the coffin of Caiaphas's plan. Under the very law he claimed to uphold, this trial was already over. There was no case. There was no legal path to the verdict he needed. And through all of it, every false word, every contradiction, every desperate attempt to manufacture a charge that would hold Jesus said nothing. Not one word of defense, not one objection, not one plea. Isaiah had written it 7 centuries before this night. Isaiah 53:7. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. 7 centuries. And it arrived in that room with the precision of a master clockmaker, setting the final gear into place. His silence was not weakness. His silence was sovereignty. Every second that Jesus stood without speaking was another second of prophecy, fulfilling itself in real time, inside the very walls of the man who thought he was running the trial. Caiaphas was not the judge in that room. He never was. He was an actor performing a role in a script he had never read, a script written by the God he claimed to represent. And then, because the plan was collapsing and the morning light was pressing closer, and the streets of Jerusalem would soon fill with people who could not witness what was happening in this room, Caiaphas broke. He did what no presiding judge under Jewish law was permitted to do. He directly interrogated the accused. He stood over Jesus, his composure fracturing at the edges, his voice rising in a register that betrayed exactly how frightened he was beneath the performance of authority. I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. The room went airless, and Jesus, the Lamb who had been silent through every lie, every contradiction, every illegal maneuver of this counterfeit court, looked directly at his accuser and spoke, I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Matthew 26:64. He did not flinch. He did not qualify it. He reached into the prophecy of Daniel 7:13, the Ancient of Days, the Son of Man, arriving on the clouds of heaven, and he claimed it, out loud, in front of witnesses, in the presence of the man who had spent months engineering his destruction. And Caiaphas tore his robes. This is the moment the mask came completely off. The theatrical gesture of horror, the ripping of the high priestly garments, was meant to signal righteous indignation. But there is something Caiaphas did not know, or perhaps something he knew and could not stop. The tearing of the high priest's robes was itself a prophetic act. It signaled the end of his office. It signaled the end of everything the garments represented. The veil was already being torn, and he was tearing himself apart in anticipation of it, without knowing it. What further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. But here is the verdict history actually recorded, not the verdict Caiaphas announced that night, but the one God had already written. The one who was condemned in that room is worshipped on every continent on earth today. The one who condemned him is remembered as a cautionary tale of what happens when a man chooses his throne over his soul. The plan worked, and the plan destroyed them. If you have ever watched the forces aligned against you appear to win, if you have ever stood in the wreckage of an outcome that felt like defeat and wondered where God was in it, leave a comment right now with the words, God's justice prevails, because that trial looked like the end of Jesus. It was the end of Caiaphas, and God never once lost control of the difference. They thought it was finished. That is the detail I need you to hold on to. Not that they were evil, though their actions were. Not that they were calculating, though they were that too. The detail that matters. The detail that makes everything that followed so devastatingly precise is that they genuinely believed it was over. The nails were in. The cross was raised. The crowd had dispersed. The body was sealed behind Roman stone with an imperial guard standing watch. Caiaphas had done what 18 years of political survival had trained him to do. He had identified the threat, neutralized it cleanly, and returned the city to order before the festival crowds even had time to process what they had witnessed. Problem presented. Problem solved. That is what he believed, standing in the shadow of Golgotha on a Friday afternoon, watching the life leave the body of the man he had condemned. And then the sky went black. Not overcast, not cloudy, black at noon, when the sun should have been burning at the height of its authority over Jerusalem. A darkness that had no meteorological explanation, that settled over the city like a burial shroud, that lasted not for minutes, but for 3 full hours. Luke 23:44 records it without elaboration, without apology, and the sun's light failed. The Greek word Luke uses means the sun was eclipsed, extinguished, as if creation itself had closed its eyes against what was being done beneath it. The streets of Jerusalem fell silent, in a way that no festival crowd, no busy marketplace, no ordinary moment in the life of that city had ever produced. People stopped walking. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Animals grew still. And somewhere in that darkness, in the suffocating, unnatural, 3-hour midnight that had swallowed the middle of their afternoon, Caiaphas stood. And for the first time in a very long time, had nothing to say. Then Jesus cried out, one final time, and died. And the earth answered. The ground beneath Jerusalem did not tremble politely, it convulsed. A violent, cracking, splitting earthquake that sent people running into the streets, that opened tombs in the hillsides outside the city, that shook the foundations of every building in a city built on the premise that God lived in one specific house and spoke through one specific family. But none of that, not the darkness, not the earthquake, not the terror in the streets, none of it, compared to what was happening at that precise moment inside the temple. A worker felt it before he understood it. A sound, not the sound of tearing fabric, but something deeper, something final, like the last page of a long book being ripped from its binding. He turned, and the veil was gone, not fallen, not blown loose by the wind, torn from top to bottom. Matthew 27-51 is precise about the direction, and it is precise about it for a reason, because something torn from the top down was not torn by human hands. No man reaches 60 feet into the air to begin tearing. This was torn from heaven downward, deliberately, decisively. As an act of divine declaration, that veil was not merely a curtain. That veil was the entire business model of Annas and Caiaphas, condensed into fabric. It was the physical embodiment of their indispensability, the barrier that kept ordinary people at a distance from God and made the high priestly family the only authorized gateway between humanity and holiness. Every sacrifice purchased through their system, every temple coin exchanged at their tables, every worshiper who needed their intercession, all of it rested on the theological premise that without them, without their office, without their exclusive access to what lay behind that veil, you could not reach God. And God reached down from heaven and tore it in two. Not chipped, not cracked, torn, completely, irrevocably. In a single moment, the cornerstone of their power became rubble on the temple floor. Picture the messenger, pale, breathless, running to find Caiaphas in the chaos of the earthquake, in the darkness still lifting from the streets, in the confusion of a city that had just watched nature itself come undone. The veil. It tore itself, from top to bottom. It is gone, and what do you say to that? What does a man who has built his entire identity around exclusive access to God say when God publicly, supernaturally, permanently revokes that exclusivity in the same hour that the man he just executed breathes his last? What Caiaphas felt in that moment, Scripture does not record. But what God was communicating is unmistakable. Hebrews 10:19. 2:0. would later put language to it. We have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain, that is, his body. The curtain was his body. And the moment his body was broken, the curtain was broken with it. Without a high priest, without a money changer, without a single temple coin, their empire had not merely been challenged, it had been rendered permanently obsolete by the death of the very man they thought they were silencing. But the night was not finished with them. As darkness gave way and the city began to breathe again, the whispers started, quiet at first, then louder, then impossible to contain, because something was happening in the tombs on the hillside that defied every category of experience available to the human mind. Matthew 27-50, 2:5-3 records it in plain language. With no attempt at softening, the tombs broke open, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. The dead were walking in Jerusalem. Known people, recognized people, men and women whose names were in the memory of the city, whose families had mourned them, whose tombs had been sealed, walking, talking, appearing to people in the streets who had no framework, no category, no theological box in which to place what they were seeing. Now, let this news travel through the city. Let it move from mouth to ear, through marketplace and courtyard, through the homes of priests and the offices of power, until it arrives where it must inevitably arrive, at the household of Annas and the chamber of Caiaphas. The dead are walking in Jerusalem, and these two men who had spent their careers controlling the narrative of God in this city, who had managed every theological emergency with the cool efficiency of men who believed they controlled the story, had absolutely no answer for this, no spin, no explanation, no bribe large enough, no edict authoritative enough, no political relationship powerful enough to contain what God was doing in the streets outside their windows. So they ran to Pilate, not with authority, with fear. The text reveals it in the trembling formality of their request. "Sir, we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again. Give the order for the tomb to be made secure.' Sir, Caiaphas, the man who had commanded Jerusalem's religious apparatus for nearly 2 decades, the man who had orchestrated a trial, manipulated a governor, and crucified the Son of God, was now standing before that same governor, using the word 'sir', begging for soldiers, because he was afraid of a dead man. Pilate gave them the guard. The stone was sealed with Rome's authority behind it. And Caiaphas walked back to his chamber, having done the only thing left available to him, tried to put a lock on what God had already decided to open. It was Sunday morning when the guards arrived. They did not knock. They did not wait to be announced. They came in the condition of men who had seen something that restructured every assumption they had ever held about the nature of reality, faces drained of color, hands unable to stay still, voices that kept breaking before sentences were finished. The stone is moved. The tomb is empty. And then the detail that should silence every skeptic, every critic, every comfortable explanation that human reason has tried to construct around the resurrection. They spoke of light. A light so absolute, so overwhelming, so categorically beyond anything the natural world produces, that it dropped trained Roman soldiers, men conditioned for combat, men who had seen crucifixions and battles and death without flinching. It dropped them to the ground like dead men. Caiaphas reached for the only tool he had left. He opened the treasury. Silver coins, pressed into the hands of shaking soldiers, accompanied by the coldest instruction a frightened man has ever given. "Tell them his disciples came at night and stole the body while you were sleeping." Matthew 28-12, 1-3. He bribed his way into the lie. And the lie spread through Jerusalem the way lies always spread, quickly, widely, and ultimately without the power to hold. Because you cannot bribe your way out of an empty tomb. You cannot pay enough silver to put a risen man back in the ground. And somewhere beneath the transaction, beneath the coins, and the manufactured story, and the thin veneer of control that Caiaphas was desperately trying to maintain, both he and Annas already knew the truth, that the silver was meant to bury. He was not there, and everything they had built their lives upon was not going to survive what came next. Leave a comment right now with the words, "You cannot silence what God has raised," because somebody watching this needs to be reminded today that the thing the enemy sealed, the thing the world declared finished, the thing that every force of opposition celebrated as their victory, God has a history of walking out of exactly those kinds of tombs. The stone was rolled away, and the empire of Annas and Caiaphas began rolling down with it. 7 weeks. That is all it took. 7 weeks from the moment Caiaphas pressed his seal into the wax on that tomb. 7 weeks from the moment he paid the soldiers their silver and sent them back to their posts with a lie in their mouths. 7 weeks, and everything he had spent his entire life constructing was already coming apart at the foundation. He did not see it coming. That is the part that should arrest you, because Caiaphas was not a foolish man. He was a survivor. 18 years at the top of the most volatile religious and political landscape in the ancient world does not happen by accident. He could read a room. He could read a city. He had navigated Roman governors and temple revolts and theological crises with the steady hand of a man who always knew which way the wind was turning. But he could not read this, because what descended on Jerusalem 50 days after the resurrection was not a wind any human instrument had ever been designed to measure. Acts 2 records it a sound like a rushing mighty wind filling the entire house, tongues of fire resting on ordinary men, fishermen and tax collectors, suddenly speaking in the native languages of people who had traveled to Jerusalem from across the known world. Parthians and Medes and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia and Cappadocia and Egypt, every one of them hearing, in their own mother tongue, the declaration of what God had done. Not rumors, not whispers, a public, multilingual, supernaturally orchestrated proclamation erupting in the heart of the city that Caiaphas controlled, that the man he had crucified was alive. And Peter stood up. Let that settle for just a moment. Peter, the same man who could not hold his composure in the courtyard of the high priest's own house, the same man who cursed and swore before a servant girl and denied 3 times that he even knew Jesus. That man stood up in the streets of Jerusalem, within walking distance of the chamber where the illegal trial had been conducted, possibly within eyesight of men who had been in that room and preached with a fire and a clarity and an authority that drew 3,000 souls into the kingdom of God before the afternoon was finished. 3,000. In one day. In Caiaphas's city. And the movement did not slow down after that. It accelerated. A man crippled from birth, 40 years of paralysis, 40 years of being carried to beg at the beautiful gate of the temple, 40 years of existing at the margins of the very religious system Annas had built, leapt to his feet in the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth and walked, right there, at the entrance to the temple, in front of everyone, an undeniable, living, breathing, jumping, praising disruption to the official theological position that the miracle worker was dead and the movement was finished. The crowd that gathered around that healed man could not be dismissed. You cannot argue with a man who is dancing on legs that have never held weight before. You cannot issue a statement that explains away 40 years of paralysis dissolving in an instant. And Peter, standing in the wreckage of their official narrative, drove the blade all the way. In Acts 3:15, you killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead. We are witnesses of this. You killed the author of life, spoken inside the temple courts, into the faces of the priests. Without a tremor, Caiaphas ordered the arrest. Of course he did. It was the only move left in his diminishing hand. A night in prison, a stern warning, the full institutional weight of the Sanhedrin brought down on 2 Galilean fishermen. Surely that would be enough to remind these men of their place. But when Peter and John stood before the council, the same chamber, the same faces that had condemned Jesus in the dark, Peter did not lower his voice. He did not soften his language. He did not negotiate. Acts 4:12 rang through that room like a verdict being handed down from a higher court. Salvation is found in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given to mankind by which we must be saved. The priests had no answer. Luke records it with devastating simplicity. They were astonished, unschooled, ordinary men, speaking with a wisdom and a boldness that no amount of institutional authority could produce or suppress. And standing right there beside them was the healed man, 40 years old, jumping, a living exhibit that needed no argument, no defense, no theological footnote. They released them. Because what else could they do? The beatings came next. The threats multiplied. And every single time the apostles walked out of a jail cell or a flogging, they went straight back to the temple courts and preached louder than before. Acts 5:41 records something that must have driven Caiaphas to the edge of comprehension. The apostles left the Sanhedrin, rejoicing, because they had been counted worthy of suffering disgrace for the name. They were rejoicing over the beatings. You cannot break what suffering only makes more certain of its purpose. And then came the blow that cut deepest of all. Acts 6-7. The number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly, and a large number of priests became obedient to the faith. His own priests, the men inside the institution, the men whose loyalty was the last structural beam holding the edifice of Annas' dynasty together, they were crossing over, quietly, one by one, walking away from the system that had made them and kneeling before the name the system had tried to execute. The defection was internal. The collapse was beginning from within. And Caiaphas, watching his own house empty out from the inside, was learning what every person who has ever tried to build a kingdom in opposition to God eventually learns: you cannot contain what heaven has commissioned. You cannot imprison what the Spirit inhabits. You cannot threaten into silence what has already decided that suffering is worth it. If you have ever watched something that looked completely finished, a dream, a calling, a movement, a promise rise back up stronger than it was before it was buried, leave a comment right now with the words, "God's plan is unstoppable," because the tomb was sealed. The movement was supposed to be dead. The name was supposed to be forgotten within a generation. 2,000 years later, the name is on every continent on earth, and the seal Caiaphas pressed into that tomb is dust. Music shifts colder now, methodical, like the turning of an inevitable gear. There is a moment in the life of every man who has built his world on the wrong foundation when the ground simply stops holding. Not a warning, not a gradual weakening, just a moment. A morning that begins like every other morning, and by the time the sun sets, everything that took decades to construct is rubble at his feet. For Caiaphas, that morning came in AD 36. But understand something first. Understand what the years between the resurrection and that morning actually looked like for this man. Because the unraveling of Caiaphas was not a sudden event. It was a slow suffocation. It was the experience of watching, month after month, the movement he had crucified grow larger and more uncontainable than it had ever been when Jesus was alive. Every arrest that failed to silence the apostles, every flogging that produced rejoicing instead of retreat, every report of another miracle performed in the name of the man whose name he had condemned, every priest who quietly crossed over, every 1,000 souls added to the movement in his city, under his watch, despite every instrument of suppression he still possessed. He had promised Rome one thing, peace. And Jerusalem was anything but peaceful. The Romans did not care about theology. They did not care whether Jesus rose from the dead, or whether the veil in the temple had torn, or whether 3,000 people were baptized on Pentecost. What Rome cared about was order, predictability, the uninterrupted flow of taxes, and the absence of uprisings. And Caiaphas, the man Rome had trusted to be the lid on Jerusalem's pressure, was watching that pressure build every single day, with no lid strong enough left to hold it. His position, which had once felt as permanent as the temple stones themselves, had become a countdown. And then Lucius Vitellius arrived. The Roman governor of Syria did not come to Jerusalem with questions. He came with conclusions. He had watched the reports accumulate, the unrest, the instability, the movement that kept growing despite official suppression, the high priest who kept promising control and kept failing to deliver it. Vitellius was not a man who extended grace to failed instruments. Rome did not retain political tools that had stopped working. In one move, swift, public, and utterly without ceremony, he stripped Caiaphas of the high priesthood. 18 years. Gone. The man who had torn his own robes in, performed outrage at the claim of Jesus, now had his sacred garments taken from his body by the hand of Rome. The man who had sat in judgment over the Son of God was now himself judged, not by heaven, not yet, but by the empire he had served, found insufficient and discarded like a broken instrument. Feel the weight of that irony. Because it is not accidental. It never is with God. Job 12:23 declares it with the quiet authority of a man who has seen enough of history to know how it works. He makes nations great, and he destroys them. He enlarges nations and disperses them. God does not need a supernatural thunderbolt to bring down a man who has stood against his purposes. Sometimes he simply removes the protection. Sometimes he simply allows the empire, a man built on the wrong foundation, to bear its own weight and watches it collapse under the load. With Caiaphas gone, the dynasty of Annas began to hemorrhage. One by one, the positions evaporated. The privileges Rome had extended to this family, the exclusive arrangements, the sanctioned authority, the carefully maintained access that had made them indispensable, Rome began reclaiming them with the same indifference with which an accountant closes accounts that are no longer profitable. The family that had controlled Jerusalem's religious life for decades, that had placed 5 sons and a son-in-law on the high priestly throne in sequence, that had built an empire inside a temple and called it ministry. That family now watched in the paralysis of the newly powerless as everything they had accumulated drained away. Not dramatically. Piece by piece. The way a body bleeds out slowly and quietly until there is simply nothing left to sustain it. What had once seemed unshakable revealed itself, in the end, to have been constructed entirely of borrowed time. And that is the word I need to leave in your chest right now. Borrowed. Every throne built in defiance of God is borrowed. Every empire constructed on the exploitation of the sacred is borrowed. Every position of influence maintained by suppressing the truth is borrowed, and the lender always, always calls the debt. Proverbs 19:21 has been true for every civilization that has ever risen and fallen on this earth. Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. Not eventually, not after a long negotiation. Prevails. Present tense. Absolute. Caiaphas had plans. Annas had plans. 18 years of masterful, sophisticated, politically brilliant plans, and every single one of them ended in the same place. Exposed, stripped, judged by the very systems they had manipulated, found insufficient and removed. The garments were taken. The title was gone. The dynasty was finished. And the name of Jesus, the name they had tried to seal inside a tomb, the name they had paid soldiers to deny, the name they had flogged men for preaching in the temple courts, that name was spreading across the known world without their permission, without their endorsement, and completely beyond their ability to stop. This is what it looks like when a man spends his life fighting God. He doesn't lose in a blaze of dramatic confrontation. He simply becomes irrelevant. The story moves forward without him. The kingdom advances past his walls, and he is left standing in the ruins of everything he chose over the truth, holding titles that no longer mean anything, in a city that no longer needs him, before a God he spent his best years refusing to acknowledge. The walls had held for 18 years, but no wall built against the purposes of God holds forever. Not then. Not now. Not ever. There are names that history preserves as monuments, and there are names that history preserves as warnings. Annas and Caiaphas did not get to choose which kind of legacy they left. That choice was made for them, in the courtyard of an illegal trial, in the exchange of 30 pieces of silver, in the darkness of a Friday afternoon, when the sky closed its eyes over Jerusalem and the earth shook in protest beneath their feet. Their legacy was sealed in those moments, and what followed, what the early Christian communities passed down from generation to generation, with the hushed gravity of people handling something almost too heavy to carry, was not mythology. It was consequence. Let me tell you what happened to Annas first. The man who had ruled Jerusalem from the shadows for decades, who had never needed a title because he had something more durable than a title, who had watched 5 sons and a son-in-law occupy the throne he no longer officially held, who had built an empire inside a house of prayer and called it devotion, that man was arrested. Stripped of every protection his name had once guaranteed, and bound for transport to Rome to answer for what his tenure had produced. But the binding itself became the judgment. Ancient Christian accounts record what his captors did with a detail so precise, so viscerally specific, that it carries the unmistakable weight of something preserved because it needed to be remembered. They wrapped him in wet oxhide, raw leather, soaked through, fitted against his body while still pliable, still yielding, still giving the impression that it might be endured. And then the sun rose, and the journey continued, and the leather began to dry. Oxhide shrinks as it dries, slowly, incrementally, with a patience that mocks the urgency of the suffering it produces. Hour by hour beneath the open sky, the material that had seemed merely uncomfortable became a mechanism of compression, tightening across his chest, constricting his arms, pressing against his ribs with a force that built so gradually it gave the mind no single moment of shock to retreat into. Only the slow, relentless accumulation of pressure. Only the incremental theft of breath. Only the body's dawning recognition that what was happening to it could not be stopped, could not be negotiated with, could not be managed by the political instincts of a man who had spent his entire life managing everything. The man who had squeezed Jerusalem's pilgrims dry, who had set the exchange rates, controlled the animals, extracted the tithe from widows who could barely afford the offering, died being squeezed, slowly, without mercy, far from home, without the robes and the deference and the architecture of power that had always insulated him from the consequences of his own cruelty. Galatians 6-7 does not stammer, it does not hedge. Whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. Annas sowed compression. He sowed the slow, systemic suffocation of people who came to God and found his family's hand in their pocket instead. And what he sowed came back to him in a form so physically precise that the early church did not speak of it as coincidence. They spoke of it as the signature of a God who is never mocked, whose justice is never late, and who has a long memory for what was done in his house. But if the death of Annas was the thunder, loud, sudden, physically overwhelming, then the end of Caiaphas was the thing that comes after thunder, the silence, the weight, the darkness that settles in when the storm has passed and you are still standing in the wreckage of everything you chose. Early traditions tell us that after the stripping of his office, after the humiliation before Rome, after the defection of his priests and the collapse of his dynasty, Caiaphas did not find peace. He found what every man finds who has done an irreversible thing and refused to surrender it to the only one who could have healed it. He found the memory. It was there when he woke, there when he slept, there in the silence between conversations, in the gap between one distraction and the next, pressing through every attempt to build a new normal on the rubble of the old one. The face of the man he had condemned, the silence in which that man had stood before his manufactured court. The words "I am" that had split the air of his chamber and carried the weight of eternity in 2 syllables. You cannot unknow what you know. You cannot unsee what you have seen. And Caiaphas had seen enough to be without excuse, which is precisely what made the guilt so total, so consuming, so impervious to every earthly remedy he might have reached for. The accounts tell us he wandered, that the man who had commanded Jerusalem's religious center with the certainty of someone who had confused his own will with God's, became a man who could not find a place to stand. No peace, no rest, no moment of genuine relief from the verdict his own conscience had been rendering against him. Since the afternoon the sky went dark and the veil tore, and the earth shook beneath his feet, and ultimately, according to those early traditions, unable to endure what he could not escape and unwilling to seek the only mercy that could have dissolved it, he took his own life. The man who had sentenced others to death, sentenced by himself. I need to stop here. And I need to speak to you with everything this moment requires, because the difference between Caiaphas and the thief on the cross next to Jesus is not the magnitude of what either man had done. It is what each man did with the weight of it. One turned toward Christ in the final moment and received what guilt alone can never produce mercy. The other turned inward and found only the mirror of his own judgment. Looking back, there is a guilt that destroys, and there is a repentance that restores, and the distance between them is not measured in the severity of what was done. It is measured only in the direction a soul chooses to turn when the weight becomes unbearable. If you have carried something, if there is a memory, a decision, an irreversible moment that follows you the way it followed, Caiaphas, leave a comment right now with the words, "God's justice brings peace," because the mercy that Caiaphas refused is still available. Right now, in this moment, to you, the same God whose justice is absolute, whose reckoning found Annas on a road to Rome, wrapped in shrinking leather, whose verdict found Caiaphas in the hollow silence of a life he could no longer inhabit. That same God stretched out his arms on the same cross they arranged and said, "Father, forgive them. The justice is real." Every word of it, and so is the mercy. The question, the only question that has ever mattered is, which one you will let find you first. In 1990, a construction crew working south of Jerusalem's Old City broke through the ceiling of a burial cave that had not been opened in 2,000 years. Inside, archaeologists found 12 ossuaries, limestone bone boxes, the kind used by wealthy Jewish families in the 1st century to house the remains of the dead after the flesh had returned to the earth. 11 of them were unremarkable. The 12th stopped everyone in the room. Carved into its surface, in the formal script of a man who expected his name to mean something, Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Inside the box were the bones of a man in his 60s. They had found him. Not a symbol, not a theological construct, not a character in a story told to make a spiritual point. The actual man, the actual bones. The high priest who had stood in a lamplit chamber and looked into the face of the Son of God and chosen his throne lying in a stone box in a forgotten cave, undiscovered for 2 millennia, waiting to be unearthed by a construction crew that was not looking for him. History had kept him, but not the way he intended. This is what I need you to understand about the God of Scripture. He keeps their names, keeps their bones, keeps their stories, not to honor them, but to ensure that what they did and what followed cannot be rewritten, cannot be softened, cannot be quietly retired into the comfortable ambiguity of legend. Caiaphas is real, which means the warning is real, which means every principle his story demonstrates is not theology in the abstract. It is cause and effect, carved into limestone, confirmed by archaeology, verifiable by any person willing to stand in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem and read the inscription with their own eyes. Joseph, son of Caiaphas, a real man, a real fall, a real God who was watching every move. But the stone box in that cave was not the final verdict on what Caiaphas and Annas had built. The final verdict came in AD 70, and it came exactly with the precision of a God who means what he says, the way Jesus said it would. He had stood in the shadow of the temple. His disciples had gestured at the grandeur of it, the massive stones, the gleaming gold, the architectural achievement that Herod had spent decades constructing to impress Rome and awe the world. And Jesus had looked at it with the calm of a man reading a document that has already been signed and said in Matthew 24:2. "Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down, not one stone." 40 years later, the Roman legions of Titus surrounded Jerusalem. The siege lasted months. The city starved from within. Josephus, the Jewish historian who witnessed it, recorded scenes of suffering so extreme that the human mind resists fully absorbing them. And when the walls finally broke and the soldiers poured through, they went straight for the temple. The fire that consumed it burned so intensely that the gold of the temple treasury melted and ran between the foundation stones. And Roman soldiers, driven by greed, exactly as God's sovereignty permitted, tore the building apart stone by stone to recover the melted gold that had run into the cracks. Not one stone left on another. Every word fulfilled. every syllable of the prophecy executed with a precision that no human military strategy could have engineered and no human resistance could have prevented. The temple that Annas had turned into a revenue machine. The courts where Caiaphas had orchestrated the arrest of the apostles. The entrance where a crippled man had leapt to his feet in the name of Jesus. The chamber where an illegal trial had been conducted by lamplight. Gone. Every stone of it, exactly as the man they condemned had said it would be. The sacrificial system, the elaborate, lucrative, dynastically controlled mechanism that had been the engine of the Annas family empire for decades, was obliterated in a single afternoon of Roman fire. Not reformed, not relocated, obliterated, because the sacrifice it had always been pointing toward had already been made on a hill outside the city walls, by the man they crucified. And once the true sacrifice was complete, the shadow of it had no more purpose to serve. The dynasty was finished. The temple was ash. The gold was in Roman hands. The family that had controlled Jerusalem's religious life for a generation watched everything, the wealth, the status, the sacred machinery of their influence, consumed in flames and blood in a single catastrophic week, and their names lived on. Oh, their names survived, but not in the hall of the honored, in the hall of the cautionary, in the category of men whose stories are preserved not to inspire but to warn, not as examples of what to pursue but as monuments to what happens when a man spends his life building his kingdom in the house of God and confusing the two. But here is the thing that should silence every cynical reading of this story. The thing that transforms the entire dark narrative into something almost unbearable in its depth. They were used anyway, in their arrogance, in their calculation, in their desperate, self-serving decision to silence the voice of God in human flesh. Annas and Caiaphas became, without knowing it, without intending it, without any possibility of having planned it, the instruments through which the greatest act of redemption in the history of the universe was accomplished. They thought they were ending the story of Jesus. They were writing the chapter that saves the world. Isaiah 46:10 declared it before either of them was born. I make known the end from the beginning. From ancient times, what is still to come. I say my purpose will stand, and I will do all that I please, not most of it. Not the parts that human cooperation allows, all of it, including the parts that human opposition tries to prevent, including the midnight trial, including the borrowed cross, including the sealed tomb, including every move that Annas and Caiaphas believed was theirs. God had already accounted for every single one and woven it into a plan they were never going to be able to derail. You cannot accidentally thwart the purposes of God. You can only accidentally fulfill them. And that is the most terrifying truth in this entire story. Not that God punished them, but that even their rebellion served him. There is one more man who needs to be named, because this story does not belong only to Annas and Caiaphas. There was a third architect of that Friday, a third man whose hands touched the machinery of the crucifixion, a third soul who stood at the intersection of human power and divine destiny and chose, with full awareness, to step to the wrong side of history. Pontius Pilate, Roman governor of Judea, representative of the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever produced, a man whose authority was backed by legions, whose word carried the weight of Caesar, whose judgment no occupied people could appeal and no local court could override. He had the power to release Jesus. He knew it. He said it himself. Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you? John 19:10. He announced his own authority in the very moment he was preparing to abandon it. And Jesus answered him with the composure of a man who understood exactly how power actually works. You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. From above, Pilate's authority over Jesus existed only because God permitted it. Which means the trial was never actually Pilate's to conduct. The verdict was never actually Pilate's to render. The entire proceeding, the crowd, the pressure, the theatrical back and forth, the escalating threats from the chief priests, all of it was unfolding inside a sovereignty that Pilate could not see and was not equipped to comprehend. But heaven sent him a warning anyway. That is the detail that should stop you cold. Because God did not allow Pilate to make this decision without first doing everything short of coercion to redirect him. While Pilate sat on the judgment seat, while the crowd was building its pressure, and the chief priests were working the room, and the political calculus of the moment was pointing toward one inevitable outcome, a messenger pushed through with a note from his wife. Claudia Procula had dreamed, and whatever she saw in that dream was disturbing enough that she broke protocol, interrupted an official proceeding, and sent a written message to her husband in the middle of a public trial with the urgency of a woman who believed something catastrophic was about to happen if he did not listen. Matthew 27-19. Have nothing to do with that innocent man. I have suffered greatly in a dream today because of him. Heaven had reached into the household of the Roman governor, into his marriage, into the sleep of his wife, and sent a warning so vivid, so viscerally disturbing, that she could not stay silent about it. God gave Pilate every grace available to a man who had not yet made the irreversible choice. And Pilate read the note, and looked at the crowd, and made his calculation. Then he called for the basin, the water, the public hand-washing, the performance of innocence designed to transfer moral responsibility from himself to the crowd. I am innocent of this man's blood. It is your responsibility. Matthew 27-24. I want you to understand what Pilate was attempting in that moment. He was trying to use ritual to overwrite reality. He was trying to use a physical act, water, a basin, a visible gesture before witnesses to dissolve a spiritual accountability that no physical act has ever been capable of dissolving. He was doing what human beings have done since the garden, reaching for something external to cover what is internal, looking for a mechanism that would allow him to proceed with what he knew was wrong while maintaining the psychological fiction that he had kept his hands clean. The water ran off his hands. The guilt did not. What followed Pilate through the remainder of his life was not the comfortable career of a man who had made a difficult political decision and moved on. Ancient accounts and early Christian traditions describe a man increasingly consumed by what he had done. His governorship deteriorated. His relationship with Rome fractured. He was eventually removed from his position, another powerful man, stripped of the authority he had used so catastrophically, and sent away from the province he had governed. Some traditions place his death in exile. Some describe a man tormented to the end by what he could not put down, could not outrun, could not wash away, no matter how many times he reached for the basin. Early accounts speak of his body being rejected, cast into water, thrown from place to place, refused by the earth itself in a detail so darkly poetic, it carries the weight of divine signature. The man who had washed his hands publicly could not find a place to rest them. No peace, no honor, no resolution. Only the accumulating weight of a single morning's cowardice pressing down on every year that followed it. Numbers 32-23 carries a warning that has never once failed to prove itself in the laboratory of human history. You may be sure that your sin will find you out. Not might, not possibly, will. The verb is certain. The timeline is the only variable. And for Pilate, the finding out began the moment the water dried on his hands, and he turned to face a world that would never fully let him forget what he had done with the moment he was given. Here is what Pilate's story teaches that Annas and Caiaphas' story does not. You do not have to be the architect of the plan to share in its judgment. You do not have to be the one who designed the trap to be held accountable for choosing to spring it. Pilate did not orchestrate the crucifixion. He simply refused to stop it when he had the power, the warning, the wife's dream, the private conversation with Jesus, the public platform, and every possible grace available to a man being given one final opportunity to choose correctly. He had everything he needed to do the right thing, and he reached for the basin instead. I need to ask you something directly, right now, not historically. Personally, is there a basin in your life? Is there a ritual, a routine, a distraction, a carefully maintained performance of innocence that you have been using to avoid the weight of a decision you already know you need to make? Is there a moment that keeps returning to you, a warning that has already been delivered, a dream that disturbed you more than you have admitted to anyone. Because the water did not work for Pilate, it has never worked for anyone. The only thing that actually cleanses, the only mechanism in the universe with genuine power to dissolve guilt rather than merely defer it, was decided on the same cross that Pilate authorized, and it is still available. Right now, before the basin runs dry, leave a comment right now with the words, "God's justice is inevitable," because somebody watching this has been reaching for the water long enough. And this is the moment the reaching stops. The judge who was judged by Pilate is the only judge whose verdict actually matters, and his court is still in session. We have walked through the dark together. We have stood in the lamplit chamber where justice was mocked and truth was sentenced. We have watched the sky go black over Golgotha. We have felt the earth shake beneath the weight of what was done. We have traced the collapse of Annas, stripped, bound, crushed by the very pressure he spent his life applying to others. We have followed Caiaphas into the hollow silence of a life dismantled from the inside, a man who chose his throne over his soul and spent the rest of his days paying the price of that choice. We have seen Pilate reach for the basin and watch the water fail him. 3 men. 3 catastrophic encounters with the same truth. 3 different ways of refusing the same mercy. And one God who used all 3 of them anyway. This is the part that should bring you to your knees. Not the judgment, though the judgment is real, documented, archaeologically confirmed, historically preserved, and spiritually exact. What should break you open is what the judgment was wrapped around. Because at the center of every dark thing in this story, at the center of the illegal trial, the crown of thorns, the nails, the cross, the sealed tomb at the absolute center of the greatest injustice ever committed on this earth, God placed the greatest gift ever offered to it. Romans 5-8 says it with a precision that no human sentence has ever improved upon. God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we were still sinners, not after we cleaned ourselves up, not after we put the basin down, not after we stopped reaching for the silver or tearing our robes and performed righteousness or washing our hands of the decisions we didn't have the courage to make. While, in the middle of it, in the wreckage of it, the cross that Annas engineered, that Caiaphas authorized, that Pilate permitted, that cross became the door. The very instrument of the greatest injustice became the mechanism of the greatest mercy. And that is not irony. That is not coincidence. That is the signature of a God who is so sovereign, so absolutely in control of every thread of this story, that he can take the worst thing human hands have ever done and make it the best thing that has ever happened to the human soul. Their names are preserved as warnings. His name is preserved as salvation. And the invitation that Annas refused, that Caiaphas walked away from, that Pilate drowned in a basin of water, that invitation is standing open right now. Before this screen goes dark, leave a comment right now with the words, "God's justice and mercy prevail," because they do. They always have, and they are reaching for you right now.